Why did no one look twice at the woman holding the mop when the room was already tense enough to snap? The mess hall at forward operating base tightened breath like a tired animal just before dawn. Fluorescent lights flickered. Metal chairs screeched against concrete. Coffee burned in dented urns that had seen too many wars. It was the kind of morning where nobody spoke unless they had to, and when they did, it was sharp, defensive, mean. She stood near the aisle, fingers wrapped around the plastic handle of a mop bucket that weighed more than it should. Not because of the water, but because of what it represented. The lowest rung, the invisible rank, the kind of job people noticed only when it was done wrong. Petty Officer Casey Thorne kept her eyes down. Her uniform was stained, grease on one sleeve, bleach burns on the cuffs, boots soaked from hours of scrubbing. She looked like someone who belonged to the background, a shape meant to move around others, never through them. And then the tray slammed. Staff Sergeant Derek Brock didn't look at her when he did it. He didn't have to. He was loud enough that attention bent toward him naturally. Ranger tab, thick neck, the confidence of a man used to being obeyed without question. "Move it," he snapped. "You're blocking the aisle." Casey shifted instantly. Too fast, maybe. Apologetic before the word even left her mouth. "I'm sorry, Sergeant." The bucket tipped when his boot caught it. Not an accident. Water spilled. Gray, cold, soaked her trousers and boots in seconds. Laughter followed. Sharp, easy. The kind that came from men who had never been laughed at while holding a mop. Brock looked down at her like she was an inconvenience that breathed. "Clumsy," he said. "This is why women shouldn't be in the military. Can't even handle a bucket. How are you supposed to handle a rifle?" Her fingers tightened. For half a second, something dangerous flickered behind her eyes. Something old, controlled, buried deep. Then it vanished. "I'll clean it up," she said softly. "Yeah," Brock laughed. "Go wash dishes, sweetheart. Leave the war to the men." He turned his back on her. And that was the moment she decided not to speak, not to explain, not yet. Because dignity, she knew, didn't need permission to exist. And because no one in that room knew what she was capable of, or what she was trying not to become again. Why would someone who had survived hell choose silence when insulted? Casey Thorne had learned early that survival wasn't always about strength. Sometimes it was about restraint, about knowing when to stay invisible, about choosing the long road instead of the righteous one. Her file said logistics, inventory, supply, a transfer from Guam, quiet, unmarried, 27, nothing remarkable. That was the version of her the base knew. But the truth lived beneath layers of deliberate mediocrity. Beneath the mop bucket, beneath the stains. 6 months earlier, she had been lying on a steel table under surgical lights that felt too bright for someone who wasn't sure she wanted to wake up again. A round had punched through her chest during a raid that didn't officially exist. She remembered the sound more than the pain, the hollow thump, like someone knocking on a door that shouldn't open. She survived barely. Command had called it a miracle, then a liability. Too aggressive, too driven, too unwilling to stop. They offered her a desk, retirement, a commendation, and a quiet exit. She refused. So they compromised. A cooling-off period, non-combat role, evaluation, time to heal physically and mentally, a test to see if the fire that made her exceptional would also be the thing that destroyed her. She chose this place. Fob Titan, remote, ugly, honest. She scrubbed floors because it reminded her of gravity, counted crates because numbers didn't lie, served food because it forced her to watch people really watch them. And she noticed things, like the way the local cleaning crew counted steps near the ammo dump, like how the birds stopped singing 10 minutes before sunrise, like how Brock never checked his six. She kept those thoughts to herself, because being right too early could get people killed. What happens when the world stops pretending it's safe? The first mortar landed without warning. The ground buckled. The sound came late, a delayed violence that turned air into pressure. Alarms screamed. Metal screamed louder. Incoming, incoming. Casey was already moving before the second impact. Not running, positioning, pallets, angles, lines of fire. The base erupted into chaos, controlled chaos, but chaos all the same. Trucks burned. Shouts overlapped. Orders collided. She found Brock's squad in the supply warehouse, pinned down by a storm of bullets tearing through corrugated walls. They were running out of ammo. She knew it before they said it. "Sergeant," she shouted over the gunfire, "they're funneling you. You need to flank left through the loading dock." Brock didn't even process the words. "Shut up," he barked. "Get down. What do you know about tactics?" She swallowed frustration. "They've got an RPG team setting up on the mess hall roof. They have an angle." I said silence. The explosion cut her off. The roof partially collapsed. Dust filled the air. 2 men went down. And then the enemy was inside. Casey felt the shift before she saw it, the change in rhythm, the way violence moved closer, personal. Brock was on his back, weapon gone, eyes wide. This was the moment. The one she had trained for her entire life. And the one she had hoped wouldn't come. Why did the supply clerk move like a predator when death walked through the door? She didn't hesitate. There was no internal speech, no declaration, just action. The pry bar was already in her hand. She crossed 20 feet in 2 seconds. The insurgent barely had time to register confusion before his wrist shattered. The rifle fell, she caught it, fired, moved, breathed. Everything slowed. Everything sharpened. 2 shots, 1 target down. Cover, reload, listen. Footstep, distance, angle. Another shot, then another. Silence returned, not peaceful but stunned. Brock stared at her like the universe had broken a rule. She didn't look at him. She moved to the wounded. Tourniquets, pressure, calm voice, authority without volume. "Get on the radio," she said. "Call danger close." "It's smashed," he whispered. "Then we do it the hard way." She tore off the supply patch. The black shirt underneath was faded, non-regulation, familiar. Grenades changed hands without question now. Outside, she ran into gunfire with the kind of certainty that only comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're willing to lose. Why does redemption often come at the edge of a ticking clock? She saw the truck instantly. Too low, too quiet, too deliberate. The timer glowed red. 45 seconds. Her world narrowed to wires and breath. Hand steady, heart slow. Brock shouted behind her. She didn't hear him. "Yellow wire." "Trap." She trusted instinct over fear. Snipped. Silence. She leaned against the steering wheel, exhausted not from fear, but from holding herself back for so long. When the general arrived, she stood straight, saluted, and finally allowed herself to be seen. Why does respect feel heavier than any weapon once it's earned? Brock couldn't meet her eyes. He didn't need to speak. Neither did she. She shook his hand firm, honest, without judgment. "Remember this," she said quietly. "Sometimes the person holding the mop is the only thing standing between you and the grave." She walked toward the helicopter as the sun broke the horizon. Not triumphant. Not bitter. Whole. Because sometimes dignity doesn't shout. Sometimes it simply acts. Why would someone who had already survived a bullet to the chest choose to disappear behind a mop instead of demanding her place back? Casey Thorne asked herself that question every morning before the sun cleared the razor wire. She never said it out loud. Saying it might have made it real, might have forced an answer she wasn't ready to give. The base woke slowly like a body sore from old injuries. Generators coughed. Boots scraped gravel. Radios crackled with half-heard warnings and weather reports no one trusted. Casey moved through it all with practiced invisibility, pushing carts, counting crates, wiping down surfaces no one noticed unless they were dirty. She liked the quiet before dawn. It was the only time the world didn't demand explanations. Her chest still ached when the air turned cold. Not the sharp pain from healing bone, but the deeper one, the memory of pressure, of lungs refusing to cooperate, of hands pressing hard against her sternum while someone yelled her name like it was a rope they were throwing into dark water. She had almost let go that night. Not because she was afraid to die, but because she was afraid of what living would cost her next. When she woke up in recovery, tubes everywhere and her heartbeat loud in her ears, she knew before anyone told her they were done with her. Not officially, not on paper, but the looks were different, careful, measuring. The looks you give a weapon you're not sure you can control anymore. You were lucky, one of the doctors had said, meaning well. Lucky wasn't how it felt. Lucky didn't include months of physical therapy where every breath felt like it might split her open again. Lucky didn't include psych evals where strangers asked if she still dreamed about the men she couldn't save. Lucky didn't include command staff talking about longevity and optics and sustainability, words that sounded harmless until they ended careers. They offered her a graceful exit. She offered them silence. The deal had been simple and humiliating. Step away from combat, prove stability, prove restraint, prove she could exist without chasing the next breach, the next explosion, the next moment where everything narrowed and finally made sense. She signed without reading the fine print. Fob Titan hadn't been assigned to her. She'd chosen it, far from cameras, far from medals, a place where no one would look twice at a logistics clerk with grease on her sleeves. A place where she could watch. And watching, she had learned, was still a kind of fighting. She noticed patterns others dismissed. The way certain locals lingered near the outer fence a little too long. The way deliveries arrived on time but never early, as if someone was syncing watches. The way Brock's squad always took the same route to the ammo shed, joking loudly, predictable as sunrise. Predictability got people killed. She almost warned them once. Almost. The words rose to her throat and died there. She remembered the deal, remembered the evaluations, remembered how quickly concern turned into paperwork. So she swallowed it. Restraint, she told herself, was not weakness. It was discipline. Still, there were moments, small, sharp moments, when the old instincts clawed up through her ribs. Like in the mess hall, when Brock laughed and called her sweetheart. The sound had landed somewhere deep, brushing against memories she kept locked away. Other rooms, other men, other underestimations that had ended with blood on tile floors. Her grip had tightened on the mop handle until her knuckles went white. For a second she had imagined stepping forward, correcting him, showing him exactly how wrong he was. Then she pictured the aftermath, the investigations, the quiet disappointment in a commander's eyes. She cleaned the spill instead. Later, alone in the supply room, she let herself breathe through the anger. Let it pass. Anger was loud, it made mistakes. She had promised herself she wouldn't make any more. The day unfolded like most days did: inventory checks, restocking, cleaning. The monotony was almost comforting. Numbers didn't bleed. Floors didn't judge. If she did her job right, no one noticed her at all. But even in the quiet, the base felt wrong. She felt it in the way her shoulders refused to relax, in the way her eyes kept tracking exits, in the way her hearing sharpened without permission. She paused near the ammo cages, pretending to adjust a clipboard while her gaze slid toward the perimeter. 2 local workers were there, sweeping. They had been assigned that sector for 3 days in a row. No one noticed. No one except her. She counted their steps without looking directly at them. 1, 2, 3, pause, 4, 5, 6, always the same distance, always stopping just short of the fence line. Mapping. Her jaw tightened. She logged the observation in a small notebook she kept tucked behind supply manifests. No names, no conclusions, just facts, just patterns. If nothing happened, it would stay a notebook. If something did, she wanted the truth written down somewhere. By late morning, the heat pressed down hard, baking the dust into the air. Casey wiped sweat from her brow and rolled another crate into place. Her body was stronger now. Not fully healed, maybe never fully healed, but capable. Capable enough to be dangerous if she let herself. She didn't. Not yet. Lunch brought another wave of noise, another round of casual cruelty. Someone knocked her cart over and didn't apologize. Someone else joked about her being part of the furniture. She kept moving, kept her face neutral. Inside, a different calculation ran constantly. Distances, cover, lines of sight. She couldn't turn it off any more than she could stop her heart from beating. Sometimes, late at night, that scared her more than the bullet ever had. What if she didn't know how to be anything else? What if all she was good for was violence, precise, controlled, devastating violence, and without it she was just empty? The thought crept in when she was weakest, when the bass went quiet and the stars came out sharp and cold above the desert, when the ache in her chest returned, reminding her how close she had come to ending. She would sit on her bunk then, boots unlaced, uniform folded just so, and breathe through the fear. Remind herself she was still here, still choosing, still more than a weapon. But choices, she knew, didn't erase consequences. That afternoon she felt it, the shift, the way the air seemed to hold its breath. Radios went quiet for half a beat too long. Somewhere beyond the walls, an engine revved and cut out abruptly. Her pulse quickened. She stacked a crate and straightened, scanning the compound without appearing to. No alarms, no shouts, just that heavy, waiting silence. The birds were gone. Casey closed her eyes for a moment and let herself remember another place, another dawn. The way her team had moved like shadows, the calm before the door blew inward, the certainty that came right before chaos. She had loved that certainty. She hated herself a little for it. When she opened her eyes, her hands were steady. Whatever was coming, if anything was coming, she would meet it the only way she knew how. Quietly, professionally, without asking for permission. Because even pretending to be invisible hadn't erased who she was. And somewhere beyond the wire, something was already moving toward the base. She could feel it in her bones. The question wasn't whether the storm would break. It was whether she would be allowed to stand still when it did, or whether the world would finally force her to stop hiding behind the mop and remember exactly why she had survived in the first place. Why did the first explosion feel less like surprise and more like confirmation? The sound didn't arrive all at once. It tore through the morning in layers, a pressure wave that bent the air, followed by a violent crack that rattled metal and bone alike. For a fraction of a second, everything froze. Birds, dust, breath. Then the base erupted. Incoming, incoming. Casey was already moving. Not running, not panicking. Moving with purpose, the way her body remembered even when her mind tried to forget. She dropped the clipboard, shoved it under a crate with her foot, and slid behind a concrete barrier as the second round landed somewhere near the motor pool. The ground jumped. Screams followed. She counted automatically. 1 impact, 2, spacing tight, too tight. This wasn't harassment fire. This was intent. The alarms wailed, sharp and insistent, but they lagged behind reality. By the time the siren reached full pitch, Casey had already oriented herself: north wall, partial breach risk, supply warehouse, likely target, fuel depot, catastrophic if compromised. Her chest tightened, Not from fear, from urgency. She saw Brock's squad sprinting toward the warehouse, weapons up, shouting to be heard over the chaos. Predictable route, same one she'd noticed all week. "Damn it," she whispered. She followed at a distance, staying low, blending into the confusion. She was still a supply clerk in everyone's eyes. No one questioned her presence. No one ever did. The warehouse doors slammed shut just as the first burst of automatic fire stitched across the corrugated walls. The sound was deafening inside, metal screaming as rounds punched through, sparks flying. The smell of oil and dust filled the air. They were pinned. Casey slid behind a stack of pallets, heart steady, eyes scanning. She listened past the gunfire, separating noise from information. Engines outside, multiple, technicals, she guessed, fast approach, coordinated. Someone shouted about ammo. Someone else screamed in pain. Brock's voice cut through it all, barking orders, trying to impose control on a situation that was already slipping. Casey waited. This was the moment restraint became a liability. She edged closer, timing her movement between bursts. She saw it clearly now, the way the attackers were shaping the fight, driving the Rangers inward, toward a kill zone that ended at the loading dock. A fatal funnel. She raised her voice, projecting without shouting. "Sergeant, they're hurting you. You need to push left now. They're setting an RPG team on the mess hall roof." For a split second, Brock looked at her. Really looked. Confusion flickered across his face, quickly replaced by irritation. "Get down," he snapped. "This isn't your place." Her jaw clenched. "It is if you want to live," she shot back, sharper than she meant to. That was when the RPG hit. The explosion was close enough to feel personal. The wall buckled inward, debris raining down. The shockwave threw Brock across the floor like a discarded doll. Casey felt herself lifted, slammed against a crate hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. Pain flared bright, insistent, right where the old wound lived. For half a second, darkness crept in at the edges of her vision. She forced it back. Not now. The smoke was thick, choking. Visibility dropped to nothing. Someone groaned nearby. Someone else wasn't moving at all. And then she heard them. Footsteps that didn't belong. Close, confident, inside the perimeter. Her body reacted before her thoughts could catch up. She rolled, came up on one knee, hand closing around the nearest solid object, a heavy pry bar used to crack open supply crates. Cold, familiar weight. The first insurgent emerged from the smoke, weapon raised, expecting resistance from the front, not from the floor. Casey didn't hesitate. She surged forward, every movement economical, violent, precise. The pry bar swung up in a tight arc, connecting with the man's wrist. Bone gave way with a sound she felt more than heard. The rifle clattered. She caught it. Time compressed. She fired twice, controlled center mass. The man dropped. The second and third were already reacting, muzzle flashes strobing through the haze. Wood splintered. Metal screamed. Casey dove, sliding behind a crate as rounds chewed into it. She inhaled once deeply, grounding herself. The AK was filthy, the recoil uneven, but it would do. She listened. Footsteps, one moving right, one left. They were trying to flank her. She smiled grimly. Too late. She popped up on the left, fired a single round. The second insurgent went down hard, helmet snapping back. She dropped again as bullets ripped through the space she just occupied. Shifted right. Another breath, another shot. Silence felt like a held note finally released. The warehouse felt suddenly too quiet. Casey stood slowly, scanning, weapon up. Clear. She cleared the chamber by habit, slung the rifle, and moved toward the wounded without a glance at Brock, who was still sprawled on the floor, staring at her like she had stepped out of a myth. She knelt, hands already working, tourniquet, Pressure, calm instructions delivered in a voice that brooked no argument. Stay with me, breathe, look at me. Her hands didn't shake. Inside, something did. A door she had kept locked for months had just been kicked open. "Sergeant," she said, not looking up, "get on the radio. Call for a danger-close strike on the mess hall roof." Brock swallowed. "Radio's dead." She paused for half a heartbeat, then nodded. "Then we fix it ourselves." She stood, ripping the supply clerk patch from her chest. The Velcro tore loudly in the sudden quiet. Underneath was the black shirt she always wore, worn thin, non-regulation, a small act of rebellion she'd allowed herself. "Grenades," she said, holding out her hand. The Rangers hesitated only a fraction of a second before obeying. Outside, the fight raged on. Casey stepped toward the door, every instinct screaming. Brock grabbed her arm. "You can't go out there alone," he said, voice unsteady. "That's suicide." She met his eyes then, really met them. "Staying here is worse," she said. "Bandage your men." She kicked the door open and ran into the storm. Bullets cracked past her, close enough to feel. She moved from cover to cover, body low, mind sharp. She cooked a grenade, counted under her breath, and threw. The explosion on the roof cut the RPG fire short. But then she saw it. The truck, parked too close to the fuel depot, suspension riding low, wrong. Her blood ran cold. VBID. She sprinted, heart hammering now, not from fear but from the math racing through her head. She yanked the door open, dragged the dead driver out, and stared at the bomb, a complex nest of wires and explosives, professional work. The timer glowed red. 45 seconds. Her world narrowed to breath and wire. Hands steady. Mind clear. This was what she was built for. This was why she was still alive. As the seconds bled away, she didn't think about Brock, or the Rangers, or the insults, or the mop. She thought about choice. About how some people spend their lives being seen, and others spend theirs being ready. And how, sometimes, the only thing standing between order and oblivion is a woman no one bothered to look at, kneeling in the dust, cutting the right wire, hopping the world would give her just 2 more seconds to prove she was never invisible at all. What does it feel like when the clock starts counting down, and the only thing louder than the battle is your own breathing? The timer glowed an unforgiving red, its numbers shrinking with every heartbeat. 45 seconds, then 40, then less. Casey felt the world narrow until there was nothing but the open truck door, the tangle of wires inside, and the faint vibration of distant gunfire traveling through the metal beneath her knees. She shut everything else out. Not the way someone panics, but the way someone commits. Her hands hovered for a moment, not because they were unsure, but because this was the line. Once she crossed it, there was no pretending anymore. No supply clerk, no mop, no hiding behind paperwork and silence. Just her. She exhaled slowly, letting her heart rate drop the way she'd been trained to do years ago, back when instructors barked at her to find calm under pressure or get off the course. She remembered that lesson now more than any other. Speed came from stillness, not from rush. The bomb was complex, not improvised in the sloppy sense. Layered, intentional, a statement. C4 packed around artillery shells, shrapnel designed not just to explode but to erase. 3 triggers she could see immediately, a timer, a receiver, and a mercury tilt switch wired to punish hesitation. Professional work. Her mouth tightened. This wasn't just an attack, it was a message. 30 seconds. She slid her multi-tool from her pocket, the same cheap thing she used to pry open stuck crates and fix jammed cabinet latches. The irony didn't escape her, a clerk's tool for a killer's problem. Her fingers moved with delicate precision, tracing wires without disturbing them, mapping the logic in her head. Red, blue, yellow. The colors meant nothing by themselves. Meaning came from intent, from pattern. She remembered a briefing from years ago, a grainy photo on a screen, an instructor's voice flat and relentless. Don't assume standard configuration. Assume they want you dead. 25 seconds. The noise around her faded into a distant echo. Someone shouted her name. Brock, maybe. She didn't turn. Sound was a distraction. Emotion was a liability. She thought briefly of the chest scar hidden beneath her shirt, of how close she'd come to bleeding out on a floor in another country, another war. How unfair it had felt then, to survive only to be told to slow down, to step aside, to be careful. Careful hadn't saved her that night. Skill had. 20 seconds. She adjusted her position, careful not to jostle the truck. The mercury switch glinted faintly. That one would trigger if she moved too much, too fast. The receiver meant remote detonation was still possible, though likely abandoned once the assault began. Which meant the timer mattered most. Her eyes settled on the yellow wire. It was always the one people ignored, always the one that looked like a decoy. She frowned. The routing was wrong, too clean, too confident. They wanted her to cut red. They wanted her dead. 15 seconds. Her chest felt tight now, but not from fear, from the weight of consequence. She knew in that moment that if she failed, there would be no posthumous explanation, no context, just a crater and a report that said unavoidable. She didn't want that. Not because she feared dying. She had made peace with that long ago, but because she refused to let her story end as a footnote. 10 seconds. She heard Brock again, closer now, his voice cracking. Casey, get away from it. She closed her eyes for half a heartbeat. Listened inward. This bomber thought he was clever, thought experience could be mimicked, thought fear would rush her hand. He was wrong. She isolated the yellow wire, fingers steady, breath slow. 5 seconds. She cut. The timer froze at 2. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the hum died. Silence rushed in, thick and disorienting. Casey sagged forward, resting her forehead against the steering wheel, lungs finally dragging in air she hadn't realized she'd been denying herself. Clear, she whispered. Her voice trembled not from fear, but from release. Hands grabbed her shoulders. Brock. He was pale, eyes wide, staring at the inert bomb like it might change its mind. You stopped it, he said, disbelief heavy in his tone. She nodded once, already stepping back, giving the device space as if it were a sleeping animal that deserved respect. Her legs felt weak now. The adrenaline was draining fast, leaving behind exhaustion that sank into her bones. Around them the battle began to shift. Gunfire slowed. Shouts changed pitch. The chaos that had threatened to swallow the base receded, replaced by a fragile, hard-won order. Casey leaned against the truck, wiping grease and sweat from her hands onto her trousers. For the first time since the attack began, she allowed herself to feel the weight of it all. The hiding. The restraint. The insult swallowed whole. She had crossed the line she'd been trying to avoid. And she knew there was no going back. When the helicopters arrived, the sound was almost gentle compared to what had come before. Rotors cut through the hot air, kicking up dust that clung to everything. Medics moved with urgency but not panic now. The base still stood. Casey straightened when she saw the general step down from the lead bird. Major General Sterling. Theater command. His presence alone said everything about how close this had come to disaster. He walked past Brock without slowing. Past the Rangers. Straight toward her. Petty Officer Thorne, he asked. She snapped to attention without thinking, muscle memory taking over. Her salute was crisp despite the grime, despite the fatigue burning behind her eyes. Sir. He studied her for a long moment. Not the way men like Brock had, not dismissive or measuring, but careful, respectful. Or should I say, he continued quietly, Lieutenant Commander. The words hit like a physical blow. Around them men froze, whispers rippled, ranks recalculated in real time. Casey let out a breath that was almost a laugh. My cover blown, she said softly. I assume I can stop counting beans now. The general's mouth twitched. You saved this base, he said. EOD confirms that device would have taken out the fuel depot and half the compound. Your cooling off period is over, effective immediately. Something in her chest loosened, not triumph but relief, validation without spectacle. She glanced at Brock, who looked like a man waking from a long, humbling dream. Sergeant, she said before the general could speak, her tone even. You held the line. He swallowed hard. I almost got my men killed. Almost doesn't count, she replied. Not today. The general watched the exchange, then nodded once, satisfied. As he turned away to address the aftermath, Brock stepped closer, his voice low. I told you to wash dishes, he said, shame heavy in every word. I treated you like nothing. Casey met his gaze. There was no anger there, no triumph. Just truth. Then learn from it, she said. That's all I ask. She looked toward the helicopter waiting in the dust, toward the life she'd been holding at arm's length for months. The mop bucket was gone now, burned, forgotten. What remained was choice. And the quiet understanding that sometimes redemption doesn't come with applause. It comes with responsibility, and the courage to be seen again after you've learned how to disappear. What happens after the gunfire fades, when adrenaline drains away and the weight of what almost happened finally settles in? The base felt different once the helicopters lifted off and the dust began to settle. Not quieter, just heavier. Like everyone was walking through the same space, but with a new awareness of how fragile it had been minutes ago. Casey stood near the edge of the compound, helmet tucked under her arm, watching medics load the last of the wounded. The sun was higher now, unforgiving, exposing everything the smoke had hidden. Shrapnel scars in the walls, burn marks on the ground, a crater where a mortar had landed too close for comfort. Her hands were still dirty. She hadn't bothered to clean them. The general had moved on to briefings and damage assessments, but his words echoed in her head all the same. Cooling off period terminated. Return to active duty authorized. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like standing at the mouth of a tunnel she knew too well. Brock approached slowly, as if afraid she might disappear if he moved too fast. His posture had changed. Shoulders lower, confidence stripped of arrogance, leaving something rawer behind. I've been in 3 deployments, he said, stopping a few feet away. I thought I knew what competence looked like. Casey didn't respond immediately. She watched a pair of Rangers quietly pick debris from a damaged vehicle, their movements subdued, almost reverent. Competence doesn't usually announce itself, she said finally. He nodded. I judged you because it was easy. She turned then, meeting his eyes fully. There was no satisfaction in it, no need to press the wound. Everyone does, she replied. That's why it's dangerous. He swallowed, absorbing that. They stood there in silence for a moment, 2 soldiers stripped of rank by the reality they just survived. I owe you my life, Brock said quietly. All of us do. Casey considered correcting him, telling him that no one owed her anything, that this was simply the job, but she let the words stand. Sometimes people needed to carry weight. It changed how they walked afterward. As Brock left, she finally allowed herself to sit, back against a concrete barrier still warm from the sun. The exhaustion hit her all at once, deep, bone-level tiredness that made even lifting her arms feel optional. This was the part no one talked about. The after. Her thoughts drifted, uninvited, to the months she'd spent hiding in plain sight. The insults, the deliberate smallness, The way she'd trained herself not to react, not to correct, not to remind anyone who she was. She told herself it was about healing. But sitting there now, she admitted the harder truth. Part of her had been afraid. Afraid that if she stepped back into that world, the world of breaching doors and cutting wires and making decisions measured in heartbeats, she wouldn't know how to stop again. Afraid that the person she became in those moments would consume everything else. She closed her eyes, listening to the bass breathe. Generators, distant voices, the ordinary sounds of survival continuing. A shadow fell across her face. She opened her eyes to see one of the younger rangers standing there, helmet under his arm, eyes uncertain. "Ma'am," he said, voice respectful but hesitant. I wanted to say thank you for earlier for the warehouse." She nodded once. "You did fine." He hesitated, then added, "We didn't even know who you were." "That's usually the point," she said gently. He smiled faintly, then walked away. Casey watched him go, something soft and unexpected settling in her chest. Maybe this was part of it too, not just the missions, not just the violence, but the quiet influence you left behind, the recalibration of what people thought strength looked like. Later, alone in her temporary quarters, she peeled off her uniform piece by piece. The black shirt clung to her skin, damp with sweat and grime. She caught her reflection in the small mirror bolted to the wall. She looked older than she remembered, not by years, by experiences. She traced the faint outline of the scar beneath the fabric, remembering the doctor's warning, the command's hesitation, her own stubborn refusal to fade quietly into the background. She had proven she was still capable. The question now was whether she wanted to keep proving it. That night's sleep came in fragments. Dreams pressed in around the edges, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet, insistent ones. Timers counting down, doors opening, faces she couldn't quite place. She woke before dawn, heart racing, hand already reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. She sat up slowly, grounding herself, breathed. This was the cost, always had been. At first light, she stepped outside. The bass was already stirring again, the rhythm of routine reasserting itself. Someone was sweeping near the mess hall. Someone else was unloading crates. Life, stubborn and unremarkable, went on. Casey walked past the mess hall without stopping. The memory of laughter and spilled water felt distant now, like something that had happened to another version of her. She paused near the supply area, eyeing a mop bucket leaned against the wall. For a moment, she considered picking it up, finishing the job she'd left undone. Then she shook her head. Not because she was above it, but because she no longer needed it. By mid-morning, orders came through, transport scheduled, Red Squadron already alerted. Her name, her real name, moving through channels that had been quiet for months. As she waited, she found Brock again, standing near the perimeter, watching the desert beyond the wire. "You heading out?" he asked. "Soon," she said. He nodded, then surprised her by extending his hand again, not as an apology this time, but as an equal. She shook it. "Next time," he said, "I won't assume." She met his gaze. "Next time," she replied, "there might not be one." That truth hung between them. When the helicopter finally lifted her away from Fob Titan, she looked down at the shrinking compound. It looked ordinary from above, small, forgettable. And yet she knew it would stay with her. Not as a battlefield, but as a reminder. That strength didn't always wear the uniform people expected. That silence could be discipline, not submission. That dignity didn't need witnesses to exist. As the horizon stretched out ahead of her, Casey rested her head back against the seat, eyes closing. She wasn't sure what awaited her next, another mission, another test, another sacrifice. But for the first time in a long while, she wasn't running from who she was. She was choosing it. And sometimes, That choice was the hardest operation of all. What do you do when the noise finally fades, and there's nothing left to fight except yourself? The helicopter ride was quieter than she expected. No shouted commands, no urgency, just the steady thrum of rotors and the rush of wind cutting across the open bay. Casey sat strapped in, helmet resting against her knee, eyes fixed on nothing in particular as the desert rolled by beneath them. She'd flown this way before, countless times, insertion, extraction, in-between moments that blurred together in memory, but this flight felt different, heavier, like she was being carried not just away from a base but out of a version of herself she'd been living in for months. She touched the trident pin clipped carefully to her vest, feeling its familiar weight. It had been returned to her without ceremony. No speech, no applause, just a quiet acknowledgement that she still belonged. Belonging, she'd learned, was complicated. When they landed, there was no fanfare waiting for her. No line of operators, no immediate brief. Just a transport vehicle and a young officer with a tablet who confirmed her identity and gestured her forward. "Welcome back, ma'am." "Back." The word settled in her chest slowly. The facility was clean, efficient, and intentionally unremarkable. The kind of place designed to disappear on maps. She moved through it like a ghost, nodding to faces she half recognized, returning salutes she hadn't expected to receive anymore. Her debrief lasted hours. They asked about the bomb, the wiring, the timing, her decisions. They asked about Brock, about the Rangers, about whether she felt any hesitation when she stepped into the open. She answered honestly. "Yes," she said when they asked if she'd hesitated. No one seemed surprised. Hesitation, she explained, wasn't doubt. It was awareness. It was the moment you acknowledged the cost before paying it anyway. When it was over, she was cleared. No conditions, no delays. Active status restored. She should have felt relief. Instead, that night, alone in a spare room with bare walls and a bed too neatly made, she sat on the edge of the mattress and stared at her hands. They were clean now. No grease, no blood, no dust. And still they felt heavy. She thought about the mop bucket, about how easy it had been to disappear behind it, how safe, how quiet. There had been a strange peace in being underestimated, in not carrying expectation, in knowing that no one was waiting for her to be exceptional. She wondered if she missed that more than she wanted to admit. Sleep came late. When it did, it wasn't violent, it was worse, ordinary. She dreamed of standing in the mess hall again, water spreading across the floor, laughter echoing too loudly. This time, when she looked down, the mop wasn't in her hands. There was nothing there at all. She woke before dawn, heart steady, mind clear. In the days that followed, she trained. Not because anyone told her to, because routine was an anchor, because muscle memory soothed the edges of thought. She ran until her lungs burned in a way that felt earned. She shot until her grouping tightened into something familiar and reassuring. Her chest held up. The scar pulled sometimes, a quiet reminder of limits that now existed whether she liked them or not. She respected it. That was new. A week later, she was called into a briefing room, smaller than she remembered, or maybe she'd just grown. A new mission scrolled across the screen. Different terrain, different threat, same stakes. She listened without interrupting. When it was over, the commander studied her for a moment longer than necessary. "You're cleared to lead," he said, "but you don't have to." Casey met his gaze. Leadership had once felt inevitable. Now, it felt like a choice, one with consequences that extended beyond herself. She thought of Brock, of the young ranger who'd thanked her, of the way people had looked at her after the truth came out, not with awe but with recalibrated respect. She nodded, "I'll lead." Not because she needed to prove anything. Because she understood something she hadn't before. On the eve of deployment, she stood alone outside, watching the sky darken. Somewhere far away, a bass-like titan was settling into its nightly rhythm. Someone was probably mopping a floor. Someone was being ignored. Someone was being underestimated. She hoped quietly that the next time it mattered, someone would look twice. But if they didn't, if they never did, she knew now that it wouldn't change the outcome. Because strength didn't depend on recognition. It depended on readiness. On the ability to stand still when everyone else panicked, to choose restraint when ego demanded noise, to act decisively when the moment finally arrived without bitterness, without spectacle. As she turned back toward the lighted doorway, Casey felt something close to peace. Not because the world had become safer, but because she had stopped trying to shrink herself to fit it. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It doesn't demand space or raise its voice. Sometimes dignity waits quietly in the background, holding a mop, counting seconds, absorbing doubt, until the moment it's needed. And when it finally acts, it doesn't ask to be seen. It simply changes everything.